The train's whistle cut through the crisp autumn air as we pulled into Cincinnati's bustling station. The city greeted us with a cacophony of sounds, vendors shouting over the rattle of streetcars, the rhythmic clatter of hurried footsteps against the platform, and somewhere, faintly, the mournful cry of a saxophone drifting through the din. It was a stark contrast to the telegram Elliot had read aloud to me just 2 days prior, its words heavy with desperation and sorrow. Now that we were here, the gravity of our purpose felt heavier, even in the vibrant chaos of the train station. Elliot adjusted his hat against the low morning sun, his expression one of quiet focus. He didn't speak much during journeys like these. His mind was a labyrinth, piecing together theories before we had even begun. I, on the other hand, couldn't help but feel an electric charge of anticipation. Though I had long grown used to accompanying Elliot on his cases, each one seemed to promise something new, something unimaginable. And this one, a vanished circus, felt more unsettling than most. A cab took us down winding streets, past storefronts adorned with gaudy autumn displays, and into a quieter, more somber neighborhood. Clara Whitmore's house sat at the end of a narrow lane, its whitewashed exterior peeling at the corners, the garden overgrown with tangled ivy. It was a house that seemed to have forgotten happier days, much like the woman who now greeted us at the door. She was small and thin, her graying hair pulled back into a loose bun. Her eyes, sunken and rimmed red, spoke of sleepless nights and an ache that words could never capture. She hesitated, wringing her hands as if mustering the courage to let us in. "Mr. Brooks?" she asked, her voice trembling. "And Mr. Vasquez?" "That's correct," Elliot said, tipping his hat slightly. Her lips tightened into a brief, nervous smile as she opened the door wider, ushering us inside. The sitting room was dim, the curtains drawn to keep out the morning light. A clock on the mantel ticked softly, filling the silence as Clara gestured for us to sit. She perched on the edge of a threadbare armchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It's my son," she began, her voice breaking almost immediately. She paused, her breathing uneven, before continuing. "Aaron. He was a performer with the circus, Le Cirque Mystique. He'd always dreamed of something bigger, something more colorful than what this town could offer. And now," her words trailed off, but her meaning hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "Mrs. Whitmore," Elliot said gently, his voice steady and reassuring. "Take your time. Tell us what you know about the circus's disappearance." Clara took a deep breath and began again, her words halting but determined. "The circus came to town last week. It set up at Riverview Park. There were posters everywhere, bright and garish, promising wonders you'd never seen before. Aaron was so excited to be back. He'd sent me a letter weeks before, saying they'd be performing in Cincinnati. But," her voice cracked again, and she reached into her apron pocket, pulling out a crumpled envelope. "This arrived 2 days before the circus vanished." Elliot accepted the envelope, carefully unfolding the letter inside. His eyes scanned the hastily scrawled words, his brow furrowing slightly. He passed the letter to me, and I read it aloud, my voice low. "Mother, something isn't right here. If anything happens to me, take this ring to someone you trust. It's important." Clara's trembling hand reached into her apron once more, this time producing a small, blackened ring. She placed it in Elliot's outstretched palm as though it carried the weight of her son's fate. The ring was heavy, charred as if it had been through fire, yet intricate patterns were still faintly visible beneath the scorched surface. Elliot turned it over, his sharp eyes studying every detail. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "It was in the envelope with the letter," Clara replied. "I don't know what it means, but it scares me. Aaron wouldn't have sent it if it weren't important." Elliot nodded, slipping the ring into his coat pocket. "We'll need to see the last place the circus was set up." "Riverview Park, you said." Clara nodded, wringing her hands again. "Yes, but there's nothing left. The police said they found no evidence of foul play. But how does an entire circus disappear without a trace?" Elliot stood, his expression unreadable but resolute. We'll do our best to find out. Riverview Park had an eerie stillness about it, as though it had been abandoned by the world itself. The sprawling field where the circus had stood was now a charred wasteland, blackened grass stretching out in strange, deliberate patterns. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt earth, and even the birds seemed to have fled, leaving behind an oppressive silence. Elliot crouched at the edge of the burn marks, running his fingers lightly over the scorched ground. "These marks," he said after a moment, "they're too precise. This wasn't an ordinary fire." "What do you mean?" I asked, standing close behind him. He gestured to the edges of the burn, where the grass seemed to have been cut cleanly away rather than singed naturally. "Look at the lines. They're too clean, almost deliberate. Whatever caused this wasn't random." My gaze followed his hand, and a shiver ran down my spine as I noticed the strange symmetry of the burn patterns. They reminded me of something ancient, something ritualistic, but I shook the thought from my mind. I was here to support Elliot, not to let my imagination run wild. "Do you have the ring?" Elliot asked, his tone thoughtful. I reached into my coat pocket and handed it to him. He held it up to the faint sunlight breaking through the clouds, his expression inscrutable. "This symbol," he murmured, tracing the faint patterns etched into the ring's surface. "I've seen it before." "Where?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "In a book," he replied, slipping the ring back into his pocket. "We'll need to visit the library." Before I could respond, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the field, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was soft, like whispers just out of earshot, and yet it seemed to come from all around us. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot glanced at me, his expression calm but curious. "Hear what?" "Whispers," I said, feeling a chill creep up my spine. "Like voices." He frowned, his gaze sweeping the field. "The wind can play tricks on the mind," he said, though his tone was far from dismissive. "Let's not jump to conclusions." We continued our search, but the sense of unease lingered. The burn marks, the ring, the whispers. All of it felt like pieces of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. And yet, as we walked back to the cab, I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers we sought were closer than we realized, and far more dangerous. The Cincinnati Public Library stood at the intersection of Elm and Ninth, its imposing stone facade a monument to knowledge and to the secrets that lay within. It had been Elliot's idea to begin our search here, though to my mind, the place felt more like a mausoleum than a sanctuary of learning. There was a weight to the air inside, a quiet solemnity that made the click of our shoes on the marble floor seem almost sacrilegious. Elliot approached the reference desk with his usual air of purpose, tipping his hat to the librarian, a stern woman with silver-rimmed glasses perched at the tip of her nose. "I'm looking for books on occult symbols," he said, his voice low and measured, "particularly anything that references rings or sigils." The librarian's eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to gauge the sincerity of his request. After a moment, she nodded and gestured for us to follow her. "Third floor, East Wing," she said, her voice clipped. "Look for the section on mythology and folklore. You'll find what you're looking for there." As we climbed the grand staircase, the dim light filtering through stained glass windows cast kaleidoscopic patterns on the walls, lending the place an almost otherworldly quality. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease, though whether it came from the case itself or the setting, I couldn't say. When we reached the East Wing, Elliot wasted no time scanning the shelves, his fingers trailing lightly over the spines of thick, dusty tomes. I stood beside him, feeling distinctly out of my depth amidst titles like The Arcane and Obscure and Symbols of the Lost World. "Do you really think we'll find anything here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot paused, pulling a book from the shelf and flipping through its pages. "Knowledge leaves breadcrumbs, Miguel," he said, his tone absent-minded. "You just have to know where to look." I sighed, resigning myself to the fact that I would be spending the next several hours in this library. scouring texts that might as well have been written in an alien language. I picked up a book at random, its cover adorned with an elaborate, swirling pattern that reminded me of the ring Clara had given us. As I flipped through its pages, the faint scent of aged paper and ink filled my nostrils, evoking memories of long-forgotten stories and secrets. Elliot, ever the meticulous investigator, had already spread several books across the nearby table, their pages open to various diagrams and illustrations. He seemed particularly interested in one text, a heavy volume with a cracked leather cover. "Look at this," he said, beckoning me over. I leaned in, my eyes following his finger as it traced a symbol etched into the yellowed parchment. It was a perfect match for the patterns on the ring, a series of interwoven circles and lines that seemed almost to pulse with hidden meaning. Beneath the illustration, a single word was scrawled in elegant script. Caliph. "What does it mean?" I asked, furrowing my brow. "I don't know yet," Elliot admitted, though his tone betrayed a note of intrigue. "But it's referenced here as part of an ancient ritual, something about binding and transference." "Binding and transference?" I repeated, my mind racing to connect the dots. "You think it has something to do with the circus?" Elliot didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the page as though willing it to reveal its secrets. After a moment, he closed the book and tucked it under his arm. "There's another piece to this puzzle," he said, his voice quiet but determined, "and I think I know where to find it." Our next stop was the Cincinnati Historical Society, a smaller, less imposing building nestled in the heart of downtown. Unlike the library, the Historical Society had an air of informality, its wooden floors creaking underfoot and its walls adorned with faded photographs and maps. The curator, a wiry man named Mr. Lowell, greeted us with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "What can I help you gentlemen with?" he asked, adjusting his spectacles. Elliot placed the leather-bound book on the counter, its cracked cover drawing an inquisitive glance from the curator. "We're looking for information on this symbol," he said, opening the book to the page with the illustration, "and any connections it might have to Cincinnati's history." Mr. Lowell's expression shifted, his brow furrowing as he studied the page. "That's an unusual request," he said slowly, "but not entirely unfamiliar." He motioned for us to follow him into the archives, a dimly lit room filled with rows of filing cabinets and shelves lined with brittle documents. He pulled a drawer open and retrieved a yellowing folder, placing it on the nearby table. Inside were photographs and handwritten notes, their edges curling with age. One photograph in particular caught my eye, a black and white image of a circus tent, its grand facade adorned with ornate designs. But what drew my attention was the crowd in front of the tent, their faces blurred and indistinct, as though the camera had failed to capture them fully. "That's Le Cirque Mystique," Mr. Lowell said, tapping the photograph. "This was taken in 1932, the last time the circus came through Cincinnati." 1932? I repeated, glancing at Elliot. "That's 30 years ago." Mr. Lowell nodded. "They were only here for a few weeks before they left town abruptly. There were rumors, of course, murmurs of strange happenings and unexplained disappearances, but nothing was ever proven." Elliot picked up one of the notes, his eyes scanning the faded handwriting. "And this symbol," he said, pointing to a sketch in the margin. "It's the same one." The curator hesitated, his gaze flickering between us and the folder. "It's said to be connected to a curse," he admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Something about a binding ritual, though the details are murky at best. If you ask me, it's all just folklore, a way to explain the inexplicable." Elliot nodded thoughtfully, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Lowell," he said, gathering the documents. "You've given us a starting point." As we left the Historical Society, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city streets. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no closer to understanding the truth than when we'd begun, though Elliot seemed more resolved than ever. "What now?" I asked, my voice tinged with frustration. "We keep digging," he said simply, his tone calm but resolute, Every answer leads to another question. That's the nature of the work. I nodded, though a part of me couldn't help but wonder if this time, the questions might lead us somewhere we weren't prepared to go. Elliot always carried himself with an air of calm authority, but as we drove toward the outskirts of Cincinnati, I could sense the subtle shifts in his demeanor. His hands rested on the wheel with practiced ease, but his jaw tightened whenever the road brought us closer to the wooded edge of the city. The conversation we'd had with the curator at the Historical Society weighed heavily in the silence between us. A curse tied to a circus, disappearing acts decades apart. These were details that threatened to blur the line between myth and reality. I didn't want to believe it, and Elliot, logical to the bone, refused to indulge the idea outright. Still, there was an unease that neither of us dared to voice. The location we were headed to wasn't on any map. Elliot had scrawled down directions based on a note tucked away in the documents we'd taken from the Historical Society, a penciled set of coordinates alongside a single word: storage. Our destination turned out to be a dilapidated warehouse, nestled in the shadow of a crumbling overpass. Its corrugated metal walls had long since succumbed to rust, and a faded sign above the entrance read Pine Street Storage Company in peeling letters. The place felt abandoned, but there was a tension in the air that made my skin crawl. Elliot parked the car at the edge of the lot, his gaze fixed on the building. He didn't speak, didn't move immediately. His silence wasn't unusual, but this time, it carried a weight that pressed down on the space between us. "You think this is it?" I asked, breaking the quiet. Elliot turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting mine. "Only one way to find out." With that, he pushed open the door and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. I followed, shoving my hands into my pockets against the brisk chill of the evening. The sun was sinking lower now, casting the warehouse in long, creeping shadows. A faint wind rattled the loose panels on the roof, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Elliot didn't bother with the front entrance. Instead, he circled the building, scanning its exterior with a practiced eye. I trailed behind him, glancing nervously over my shoulder every few steps. It wasn't just the isolation of the place that unnerved me. It was the nagging feeling that we weren't alone. I couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. We found an unlocked side door, its hinges groaning in protest as Elliot pushed it open. Inside, the warehouse was a cavernous space, its interior cloaked in shadow. The only light came from the fading sun, streaming through cracks in the walls and ceiling. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and rust, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed in the distance. Elliot pulled a flashlight from his coat pocket and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Stay close," he said, his voice low but steady. "Don't have to tell me twice," I muttered, stepping into the pool of light cast by his flashlight. The warehouse was filled with rows of metal shelving units, their surfaces covered in dust and cobwebs. Most were empty, but a few held boxes and crates, their labels long since faded. We moved cautiously, our footsteps muffled by the grime-coated floor. Every so often, Elliot would stop to examine a box or shine his light into a dark corner, his sharp eyes searching for anything out of place. We found it near the back of the warehouse, a large wooden crate, its surface scorched as though it had been exposed to fire. The markings on its side were barely legible, but the faint outline of a circus tent was visible beneath the layers of soot. Elliot knelt beside it, his flashlight illuminating the latch. "This is it," he said, more to himself than to me. "This has to be it." He produced a crowbar from his satchel, because of course Elliot carried a crowbar, and began prying the crate open. The wood groaned in protest, splintering under the force of his movements. I stood watch, my eyes darting nervously around the darkened space. The creaking of the wood seemed too loud, too intrusive, as if it might draw unwanted attention. When the crate finally gave way, Elliot's light fell upon its contents. Costumes. Dozens of them, folded neatly despite the damage to the crate. They were elaborate, colorful, ringleader coats, sequined leotards, and velvet capes, all bearing the unmistakable style of a bygone era. But there was something off about them, something that sent a chill down my spine. They were too pristine, too untouched by time, as though they had been waiting for us. Elliot reached into the crate, pulling out a photograph that had been tucked between the folds of fabric. He held it up to the light, his expression inscrutable. I leaned in to get a better look. It was a group photo, black and white, depicting the performers of Le Cirque Mystique. Their faces were smiling, their poses theatrical, but their eyes were haunting. They seemed to stare directly at the camera, at us, their expressions frozen in an uncanny mix of joy and fear. "Look at this," Elliot said, pointing to the edge of the photo. There, standing slightly apart from the group, was a young man with a fire breather's torch in his hand. Aaron Whitmore, Clara's son. I breathed, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot nodded, his jaw tightening. "This confirms he was with the circus, but it doesn't tell us where they went." As he tucked the photograph into his coat, something clattered in the distance. A sharp, metallic sound that echoed through the warehouse. Both of us froze, our eyes meeting in silent understanding. Elliot extinguished the flashlight, plunging us into darkness. We waited motionless, as the sound of footsteps reached our ears. They were slow, deliberate, drawing closer with each passing second. My pulse quickened, my breath catching in my throat. I reached for the revolver at my side, my fingers trembling as they closed around the grip. Elliot placed a hand on my arm, a silent signal to hold steady. The footsteps stopped just beyond the row of shelves where we were hiding. I strained my ears, trying to catch any hint of movement, but the silence was deafening. Then, a voice, low and guttural, speaking words I couldn't understand. It was followed by a sound I can only describe as wrong, like the hum of electricity mixed with the growl of an animal, reverberating in my chest. Elliot's hand tightened on my arm, and I knew what he was thinking. We needed to move. Slowly, carefully, we edged our way toward the side door, keeping to the shadows. The voice continued, interspersed with that unnerving sound, but it seemed to stay in one place. My heart was pounding so loudly I was certain it would give us away. When we finally reached the door, Elliot pushed it open just enough for us to slip through. We stepped into the night, the cold air a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the warehouse. Neither of us spoke as we made our way back to the car, our breaths coming in short, shallow bursts. Elliot didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the warehouse. "Whatever's in there," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "It's not finished with us." The ride back from the warehouse was spent in silence, save for the rhythmic hum of the car's engine and the occasional creak of the suspension as we hit a rough patch of road. Elliot drove with both hands firmly on the wheel, his gaze fixed ahead in that way of his calm, composed, but hiding the storm of thoughts brewing beneath the surface. I didn't press him. I knew better than to break his concentration when he was working through a problem. Still, my own mind was racing, replaying the events in the warehouse, trying to make sense of what we had found and what had nearly found us. When we arrived back at the inn where we had been staying, the streets were bathed in the pale glow of gas lamps, and the air carried the scent of rain that had yet to fall. The innkeeper, a kindly woman named Mrs. Harlow, greeted us with a polite nod as we made our way to our room, but her eyes lingered on us for a moment too long. I couldn't blame her. We must have looked like we'd seen ghosts, though neither of us would admit it. Elliot set his satchel down on the small wooden table in the corner of the room and began unpacking its contents. The photograph from the crate, the charred costumes, and a series of notes he had scribbled during our visit to the warehouse. I sat across from him, leaning back in my chair, trying to shake off the weight that seemed to have settled on my chest. "What do you make of it?" I finally asked, gesturing to the photograph. Elliot picked it up, holding it under the lamp's light. His eyes scanned the faces of the performers, lingering for a moment on Aaron Whitmore. "It confirms his presence with the circus," he said, his voice measured. "But it raises more questions than it answers. Why leave this behind? And why were the costumes untouched?" I nodded, though the questions only added to my unease. "And that voice?" I added, my tone low. What do you think that was? Elliot didn't answer right away. He set the photograph down and leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. I don't know, he admitted, which was not something he said often. But I intend to find out. The following morning, we paid a visit to the offices of Caldwell Enterprises, the name that had appeared repeatedly in the documents we had taken from the Historical Society. Henry Caldwell was a man of considerable influence in Cincinnati, a businessman with deep pockets and deeper connections. If the circus had been involved in anything illicit, there was a good chance Caldwell was pulling the strings. The receptionist greeted us with a practiced smile, though it faltered slightly when Elliot handed her his card. Mr. Caldwell is a busy man, she said, her tone polite but firm. Do you have an appointment? We don't, Elliot replied, his voice calm but authoritative. But I'm sure Mr. Caldwell will make time for us once he sees this. He handed her the photograph, the one from the warehouse. Her eyes widened slightly as she glanced at it, and I saw the faintest hint of recognition flash across her face before she quickly masked it with professionalism. One moment, please, she said, rising from her desk and disappearing through a set of double doors. When she returned a few minutes later, she gestured for us to follow her. Mr. Caldwell will see you now, she said, her tone clipped. Henry Caldwell's office was as imposing as the man himself. A massive oak desk dominated the room, its surface polished to a mirror-like shine. The walls were lined with shelves of leather-bound books, their spines gilded with titles that spoke of wealth and power. Caldwell stood behind the desk as we entered, his large frame casting a long shadow in the dim light. Mr. Brooks, he said, extending a hand, and Mr. Vasquez. To what do I owe the pleasure? Elliot shook his hand but didn't return the pleasantry. Instead, he placed the photograph on the desk, sliding it toward Caldwell. We're investigating the disappearance of Le Cirque Mystique, he said, and your name has come up more than once. Caldwell's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that told me we were on the right track. He picked up the photograph, studying it for a long moment before setting it down. I don't see how I could be of any help, he said, his tone carefully neutral. We know you had financial ties to the circus, Elliot pressed, and we believe those ties may have extended beyond simple sponsorship. Caldwell's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but he maintained his composure. I was a patron of the arts, he said smoothly. Le Cirque Mystique was a unique attraction, one that brought joy to this city. I supported them, yes, but I had no involvement in their disappearance. Elliot didn't blink. Then perhaps you can explain why the circus seems to vanish every few decades, always leaving behind whispers of strange occurrences. And perhaps you can explain this. He pulled the ring from his pocket, holding it up for Caldwell to see. The reaction was subtle but telling. Caldwell's eyes widened ever so slightly, and his hand twitched as if he wanted to reach for the ring but thought better of it. Where did you get that? He asked, his voice dropping an octave. It was sent to us by someone connected to the circus, Elliot said. Someone who feared for their life. Caldwell leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. I don't know what you're insinuating, Mr. Brooks, but I assure you I have nothing to hide. Elliot held his gaze for a long moment before slipping the ring back into his pocket. I hope for your sake that's true, he said, his tone as sharp as a blade. Because if we find out otherwise, you'll have a lot more than your reputation to worry about. With that, he stood, gesturing for me to follow. I glanced back at Caldwell as we left, noting the tension in his jaw and the way his hands gripped the arms of his chair. He was hiding something, and we both knew it. As we stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, Elliot's pace quickened, his long strides carrying him toward the car. He knows more than he's letting on, he said, his voice low but charged with determination. You think he's involved? I asked, though the answer seemed obvious. He's connected, Elliot said. The question is how deeply. We spent the rest of the day following up on leads, piecing together the fragments of information we had gathered. Each clue seemed to lead us closer to something vast and intricate, like a web that had been spun over decades. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. We were no closer to the truth, but the stakes felt higher than ever. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the cracks in the ceiling, I couldn't shake the image of the photograph. The performers' faces frozen in time, their eyes filled with a haunting mixture of hope and despair. Whatever had happened to them, whatever had caused the circus to vanish, it wasn't just about money or power. There was something else at play, something darker, and it terrified me to think of what we might uncover. But as I glanced across the room at Elliot, seated at the small desk with his notes spread out before him, I felt a flicker of reassurance. He was relentless, unyielding in his pursuit of the truth. And as long as he was leading the way, I knew we had a chance, even if the path ahead was shrouded in shadows. The faint glow of dawn was just beginning to creep through the edges of the heavy curtains when I woke to the sound of Elliot pacing. His footsteps, steady yet measured, fell in a relentless rhythm that filled the room. I blinked against the dim light and sat up slowly, groaning as I rubbed the sleep from my eyes. The desk lamp was still on, casting a muted yellow light over the papers and photographs scattered across the small wooden table. Elliot's silhouette moved through the dimness like a restless ghost, his hands clasped behind his back as he mulled over the evidence in his usual silence. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He paused mid-step, glancing at me with tired eyes that betrayed just how much this case had weighed on him. "Sleep is a luxury we can't afford right now," he said simply, his voice low and steady. "Caldwell knows more than he's letting on. I'm sure of it." I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and stood, stretching as I tried to shake off the stiffness of the night. "So what's the plan?" I asked, moving to the table and glancing at the notes he had been poring over. Elliot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the photograph of the circus performers, the one we had found in the warehouse, and held it up to the light. "We need to find out more about this symbol," he said, pointing to the faint sigil etched into the corner of the photograph. "And we need to understand the connection between Caldwell and Victor Seville. If this really is about a bargain, then it's time we find out exactly what was traded." Our first stop was the Riverview Cemetery, a sprawling expanse of weathered headstones and ancient oaks that cast long shadows over the mist-covered grounds. According to the Historical Society's records, Victor Seville had been buried here after his sudden and mysterious death in 1932, the same year the circus had first vanished. Elliot had insisted that we visit the grave, though I couldn't quite see the point. What could we possibly learn from a man who had been dead for 30 years? The caretaker, an elderly man with a stooped back and a penchant for mumbling to himself, led us to the plot in question. The headstone was simple, its inscription weathered but still legible. Victor Seville, 1887 to 1932. A visionary lost too soon. The ground beneath it was uneven, as though the earth itself had struggled to contain whatever lay within. Elliot knelt beside the grave, his sharp eyes scanning the surrounding area. "There's something off about this," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "What do you mean?" I asked, crossing my arms against the chill in the air. He gestured to the ground. "The soil here, it's been disturbed recently." I frowned, stepping closer to get a better look. At first glance, it seemed like any other grave, but as I looked closer, I noticed the subtle signs Elliot was referring to. The faint indentation of a spade, the loose texture of the soil. "You think someone's been digging here?" "I don't think," Elliot said, rising to his feet. "I know." Before I could press him further, the caretaker reappeared, his face pale and his hands trembling as he clutched the brim of his hat. "You should leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elliot turned to him, his expression calm but firm. "Why?" The caretaker hesitated, his eyes darting nervously between us and the grave. "This place," he said finally, his voice shaking. "It's not right. I've been here 20 years, and I've seen things I can't explain. People come and go, digging where they shouldn't be, leaving behind things." "Things like what?" Elliot pressed, his tone taking on that quiet intensity that always made people open up. The caretaker swallowed hard, his knuckles white as he gripped his hat. "Symbols," he said finally. carved into the headstones, burned into the ground. And then there are the whispers at night when the wind dies down. They say his bargain didn't end with his death. Elliot nodded, as though the caretaker's words confirmed something he had already suspected. "Thank you," he said, his voice as steady as ever. "You've been very helpful." The caretaker didn't reply. He simply turned and shuffled away. His shoulders hunched as though the weight of the cemetery's secrets had become too much to bear. From the cemetery, we made our way to the Cincinnati Gazette, the city's oldest newspaper, in search of records that might shed light on Victor Seville's life and death. The archives were housed in the basement, a dimly lit labyrinth of filing cabinets and shelves stacked high with yellowing newspapers. The air was thick with the smell of aged paper and dust, and the only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Elliot navigated the archives with the precision of someone who had spent countless hours in such places, his fingers deftly flipping through folders and pulling out articles of interest. I stood nearby, scanning the headlines for anything that might stand out. It wasn't long before Elliot let out a low hum of satisfaction, holding up a worn copy of the Gazette from August 1932. "Listen to this," he said, his voice tinged with intrigue. "Victor Seville, renowned ringmaster of Le Cirque Mystique, found dead under mysterious circumstances. Authorities suspect foul play, but no suspects have been named. Witnesses report hearing strange sounds the night before his death, described as unearthly." I raised an eyebrow. "Unearthly?" I echoed. "That's not exactly comforting." Elliot's eyes flicked back to the article. "It gets stranger. Sources close to the circus claim that Seville had been acting erratically in the weeks leading up to his death, speaking of a great sacrifice and a debt that could never be repaid. The circus has since disbanded, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions." "Great sacrifice?" I repeated, a knot forming in my stomach. What the hell was he talking about? "That's what we need to find out," Elliot said, folding the newspaper and tucking it into his satchel. By the time we returned to the inn, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the night sky. The room felt colder than it had that morning, as though the weight of the day's discoveries had seeped into the walls. Elliot spread the articles and photographs across the table, his eyes scanning them with the intensity of a man trying to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces. Seville's death, the circus's disappearance, the ring, Caldwell's involvement. "It's all connected," he said, more to himself than to me. "But how?" I asked, sinking into the chair across from him. "What's the link?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up the ring and held it up to the light, his brow furrowing in thought. "The caretaker mentioned symbols," he said finally, "and the archives mentioned a debt. If Seville made a bargain, then it stands to reason that these symbols are part of it." I frowned, leaning forward to get a closer look at the ring. "You think there's some kind of key?" "It's possible," Elliot said, his tone thoughtful. "But we need more information. If this is a key, then we need to find the lock it opens." Our search took us into the depths of the city, to places forgotten by time and remembered only by those who preferred to remain in the shadows. We spoke to people who claimed to know Seville, who whispered of dark rituals and unseen forces that had guided his hand. Each story added another layer to the enigma, but none provided the answers we sought. It was in one of these places, a dimly lit speakeasy hidden beneath an unassuming storefront, that we found our next lead. A man named Tobias Greer, a former performer with Le Cirque Mystique, sat hunched over a glass of whiskey, his eyes clouded with the weight of memories best left undisturbed. Elliot approached him with the photograph, sliding it across the table. "I'm looking for answers," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I think you have them." Greer stared at the photograph for a long moment before letting out a bitter laugh. "Answers?" he repeated, his voice tinged with both anger and sorrow. "There are no answers, only curses." "What do you mean?" Elliot pressed, his eyes narrowing. Greer hesitated, his gaze flickering between us and the photograph. "Seville made a deal," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "A deal with something not of this world. He thought he could control it, but he was wrong. And now we're all paying the price. Who's we? I asked, leaning forward. The performers, Greer said, his voice trembling. We were the price. Our lives, our souls, bound to that damned circus. It's not just a curse. It's a prison. Elliot's jaw tightened. And the ring? He asked, pulling it from his pocket. Greer's eyes widened in terror, and he recoiled as though the very sight of it burned him. Get that thing away from me, Tobias Greer gasped, recoiling from the sight of the blackened ring as if it carried the weight of all his fears. Elliot swiftly pocketed the ring, respecting the man's visible panic, but his gaze remained fixed on Tobias Greer. The tension in the room was thick, like the air before a thunderstorm. Greer ran a trembling hand through his hair, his glass of whiskey untouched now, as if he no longer trusted his grip to steady it. His words came out halting and fractured, as though dragging them from the recesses of his memory caused him physical pain. You don't understand, he finally said, his voice trembling. That ring, it's part of it, part of the deal Seville made. We were all part of it. Elliot leaned forward slightly, his tone calm but laced with urgency. What deal? Tobias, we need you to explain. If there's any way to stop this, if there's any way to undo what's been done, we need to know. Greer hesitated, his gaze darting between us as if he was measuring whether we were worthy of the truth. Finally, he exhaled deeply, slumping forward as though the weight of his memories pressed down on him too heavily to bear. The circus was dying. He began, his voice hollow. Seville. He was desperate. The crowds weren't coming, the acts were stale, and the debts were piling up. He'd started dabbling in things he didn't understand. Old books, strange rituals. He claimed they held the answers, a way to save the circus. What kind of rituals? I asked, unable to keep the unease from creeping into my voice. Greer's eyes flicked to me, hollow and haunted. The kind that makes you wish he'd let the circus die, he said. At first, it seemed harmless, little ceremonies, chants. But then the whispers started. At the mention of whispers, I felt a chill run down my spine. Greer must have noticed my reaction because his voice lowered further, as if the words themselves were dangerous to say aloud. It was like they were everywhere, just out of earshot, always in the shadows. Seville started saying he was in contact with something that could save the circus, give it eternal life. He called it the Whisperer. The Whisperer? Elliot repeated, his tone sharp but controlled. Who or what is that? Greer shook his head, his expression tightening as though the mere thought of it pained him. It's not something I can explain, he said, his voice trembling. It's not human. It's not anything you'd understand. But whatever it is, it promised Seville exactly what he wanted. Crowds, wealth, immortality. But there was a price. What price? Elliot asked, his voice low, steady. Greer hesitated, his hands tightening into fists. Us, he whispered. The performers, the circus, all of it. The Whisperer feeds on us, on our souls, our very being. Every time the circus disappears, we're pulled into somewhere else, someplace dark and endless, where the Whisperer watches. And when the circus returns, we do too, but not all of us and not the same. Elliot was quiet as we walked back to the car. Quiet in the way that meant his mind was working on overdrive, connecting threads only he could see. Tobias Greer's revelations clung to me like the damp chill in the night air. The idea of the performers being bound to a circus that fed on their very essence, of a force known only as the Whisperer, lurking just beyond comprehension, sent shivers crawling up my spine. I wanted to speak, to break the oppressive silence with some shred of logic or reason, but the weight of what we had learned silenced me. Elliot, of course, wasn't one to be spooked. He'd faced enough dark, twisted cases in his career to develop a sort of emotional armor, one that could absorb the brunt of even the most terrifying truths. But as he slid into the driver's seat, I caught a glimpse of something in his expression, a tightness around the eyes, a stiffness in his jaw. It wasn't fear exactly, but it wasn't nothing either. We drove through the city in silence, the hum of the car engine a stark contrast to the turbulent thoughts swirling in my mind. The streets were empty at this hour, their usual vibrancy dulled by the late hour and the heavy fog that had begun to settle in. The lampposts cast long, distorted shadows across the cobblestones, and for a brief, absurd moment, I imagined I could see them moving, shifting and reaching like spectral arms. I shook the thought away, focusing instead on the steady rhythm of the engine beneath us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Elliot spoke. "We need to go back to where it all started." His voice was calm, measured, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. I frowned, glancing at him from the passenger seat. "You mean Riverview Park?" He nodded, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "If the circus left behind anything, any clue, any trace, we'll find it there. And if we don't, then we'll know we've reached the edge of what this world can explain." The weight of his words settled over me like a lead blanket. I opened my mouth to protest, to suggest that maybe we should wait until morning, until the sun could chase away the shadows and the whispers they seemed to carry. But I knew better than to argue with Elliot when he was like this, focused, determined, relentless. Riverview Park was a different beast at night. By day, it had been eerie but manageable, a field of charred grass that spoke of tragedy but held no immediate danger. Now, under the pale light of the moon and the ever-encroaching fog, it felt like stepping into another world. The air was cold and still, the kind of stillness that made the slightest sound, a rustle of leaves, the crunch of gravel underfoot, seemed deafening. Elliot parked the car at the edge of the lot and stepped out, his movements deliberate and precise. I followed suit, though every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay inside, to lock the doors and pretend I hadn't seen the shadows flickering in the corners of my vision. "We stick together," Elliot said, his voice low but firm. It wasn't a suggestion. I nodded, gripping the flashlight I'd brought from the car. The beam of light cut through the fog, illuminating the twisted remnants of what had once been the circus grounds. The burn marks were still there, their edges sharp and unervingly deliberate. But there was something else now, something new. Symbols. They were carved into the ground, into the trees, into the very air itself, it seemed. They glowed faintly, pulsing with a dim, otherworldly light that made my stomach churn. They were the same symbols we'd seen on the ring, on the photographs, in the shadows of the lives the circus had consumed. Elliot crouched beside one of the carvings, his brow furrowed in concentration. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the glowing lines, but he didn't touch them. "It's a tether," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "A way to anchor the circus to this world, or to keep it from fully leaving." I shuddered, my grip tightening on the flashlight. "You're saying it's still here?" "Not physically," Elliot said, standing, "but its presence lingers, like a footprint in the sand." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the symbols that seemed to stretch endlessly into the fog. "Or a doorway." The word hung in the air between us, heavy and ominous. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the way my heart was pounding against my ribs. "A doorway to what?" Elliot didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began walking toward the center of the field, his steps confident despite the fact that the ground seemed to shift and writhe beneath us. I followed reluctantly, my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. We reached what must have been the heart of the circus, the spot where the grand tent had once stood. The air was thicker here, heavier, as though we were wading through something unseen. The symbols were brighter, their glow pulsating in time with a low hum that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. Elliot knelt once more, his hands brushing over the charred earth. This time he didn't hesitate. He pulled the ring from his pocket and held it above the ground, his expression unreadable. The hum grew louder, the symbols glowed brighter. I took a step back, my stomach twisting with unease. "Elliot," I said, my voice shaky, "what are you doing?" "I need to see," he said simply, his tone unwavering. "I need to know." Before I could stop him, he pressed the ring into the earth. The world exploded. Not literally, but it felt like it. A burst of light erupted from the ground, blinding and brilliant, and I stumbled backward, shielding my eyes. The hum became a roar, deafening and all-encompassing, and for a moment I thought I could hear the whispers Tobias had spoken of, surrounding us, taunting us. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I opened my eyes slowly, blinking against the afterimage of the light. The field was different. The symbols were gone, but the ground was no longer charred. Instead, it was whole, unbroken, as though the fire had never touched it. The air, however, was heavy with the scent of smoke and something else. Something metallic, like blood. Elliot stood motionless, his hand still pressed to the ground. The ring was gone. "Elliot," I said cautiously, stepping closer. "What just happened?" He didn't respond immediately. When he finally looked up at me, his face was pale, his eyes wide with something I rarely saw in him. Fear. "It's a trap," Elliot repeated, his voice barely more than a whisper. He rose slowly, brushing the dirt from his knees as his eyes scanned the now unblemished field. There was an almost imperceptible tightness in his movements, a tension that spoke to the gravity of what we were facing. I could feel it too, a knot in my chest that only tightened with every passing second. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to keep it steady. My flashlight wavered as I turned the beam toward him, illuminating the sharp angles of his face and the dark shadows under his eyes. Elliot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze back toward the ground where the ring had vanished, his expression unreadable. "Whatever this place is," he said finally, "whatever the circus is, it's designed to pull you in, to make you a part of it." I felt my stomach drop, the implications of his words settling heavily on my mind. "And the ring?" I asked, swallowing hard. "What just happened?" "It's gone," Elliot said simply, his tone as matter-of-fact as if he'd just stated the weather. "It's part of this now." The cold weight of fear crept along my spine, and I couldn't stop myself from taking a step closer to him. "So what do we do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot finally turned to look at me, his expression softening just enough to remind me why I trusted him to lead us through even the darkest of mysteries. "We find the truth," he said, "and we end this." The air grew heavier as we made our way deeper into the field, the faint glow of the moon casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe like living things. I kept close to Elliot, my fingers gripping the flashlight so tightly that my knuckles ached. The silence around us was deafening, broken only by the crunch of our boots against the damp earth. It wasn't long before we found it. A tent, smaller and more tattered than the grand structure we'd seen in old photographs, but unmistakably part of the circus. Its faded red and white stripes flapped weakly in the windless air, and the faint smell of smoke and decay clung to it like a shroud. I stopped in my tracks, staring at it with a mix of awe and dread. "It's still here," I murmured, more to myself than to Elliot. "Of course it is," Elliot replied, his tone devoid of surprise. He didn't hesitate as he stepped forward, pushing aside the heavy flap that served as the entrance. The gesture was so natural, so fearless, that it took me a moment to realize he had already disappeared inside. I hesitated, my heart pounding painfully in my chest. There was something deeply wrong about this place, something that made every instinct in my body scream at me to turn and run. But I couldn't. Not now, not after everything. So I took a deep breath, tightened my grip on the flashlight, and followed him inside. The interior of the tent was wrong. That was the only word I could think of to describe it. The space was impossibly large, stretching out in every direction like an endless void. The air was thick and stifling, heavy with the acrid scent of burning wood and something sweeter, more sickly. And the light, there was no visible source, but the entire space was bathed in a faint, unnatural glow that seemed to pulse with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. Elliot stood in the center of the tent, his hands clenched into fists at his sides as he stared up at something I couldn't see. I stepped closer, my eyes straining to make sense of the shifting shadows and flickering lights that surrounded us. And then I saw them, the performers, They were there, their faces frozen in expressions of joy and terror, their bodies contorted in ways that defied logic and reason. They hung suspended in the air, as if caught in the middle of their acts, their eyes blank and unseeing. It was like looking at a macabre tableau, a twisted parody of the life they had once lived. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's them," Elliot said, his tone flat and emotionless. "What's left of them." I felt bile rise in my throat, the sheer horror of what I was seeing threatening to overwhelm me. But I forced myself to look away, focusing instead on Elliot. "We have to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "We can't help them." "Yes, we can," Elliot said, his voice suddenly sharp. He turned to me, his eyes blazing with determination. "This is the Whisperer's doing. It's keeping them here, feeding on them. But if we can sever its connection, we can free them." "How?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "The symbols," Elliot said, his gaze shifting back to the performers. "They're the key. They're what's keeping this place tied to our world." I nodded, though the fear in my chest threatened to drown me. "Then let's destroy them." What happened next was a blur of chaos and terror. Elliot moved with a precision and focus that I had come to expect from him, his every step deliberate as he traced the symbols that lined the edges of the tent. I followed close behind, my flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness as I kept watch for, I didn't even know what. But we weren't alone. The whispers started softly, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. But they grew louder, more insistent, until they filled the air around us, their words incomprehensible but undeniably malevolent. The shadows began to move, stretching and writhing like living things, their forms growing sharper and more defined with every passing moment. "It's trying to stop us," Elliot said, his voice calm despite the growing chaos. "Don't lose focus." Easier said than done. I could feel the shadows pressing in around us, their presence suffocating, their whispers digging into my mind like claws. But I kept moving, following Elliot as he worked to destroy the symbols one by one. With each mark he erased, the tent seemed to shudder, the fabric rippling as though it were alive. And then, just as Elliot reached the final symbol, everything stopped. The whispers fell silent, the shadows froze, and the air grew impossibly still. For a moment I thought we had succeeded, but then I heard it, a voice, deep and resonant, echoing through the void. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. It spoke in a language I didn't understand, its words a twisted melody that made my skin crawl. Elliot didn't hesitate. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he erased the final symbol. Elliot's erasure of the final symbol triggered an explosion of light so intense that I instinctively shielded my eyes, stumbling backward into the void. The roar of sound that accompanied it was not just heard. It was felt, reverberating deep in my chest and rattling my bones. My sense of direction vanished, swallowed by the onslaught of brilliance and noise. For a moment, I thought the world itself was tearing apart. And then, as abruptly as it had started, everything stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a hollow void that seemed to stretch endlessly. I forced my eyes open, blinking against the residual brightness. The tent, the symbols, the performers, all of it was gone. We were standing in the same field, but it wasn't the same place. The charred ground was now smooth and unblemished, the air thick with an unnatural stillness.
"I'm here," came his reply, steady but distant. He stood a few feet away, his silhouette barely visible against the faint glow that lingered in the air. He was staring at something, someone, just beyond my line of sight. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. As I moved, the figure came into view. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with features so sharp they seemed almost inhuman. His eyes burned with an otherworldly light, and his presence radiated a cold, oppressive energy that sent shivers racing down my spine. "The Whisperer," Elliot said, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head, as if amused. When it spoke, its voice was a chorus, 1,000 tones blending into one. "You are bold, coming here, meddling where you do not belong." Elliot took a step forward, his expression calm but resolute. "I don't care who or what you are," he said. "You have no right to hold these people. Release them." The whisperer laughed, a sound that echoed through the field like the toll of a great bell. "You misunderstand, detective. They are not my prisoners. They are my bargain. Their souls are mine, given willingly in exchange for their desires." "They didn't know the cost," Elliot shot back. "That's not a bargain. That's coercion." The whisperer's expression darkened, its burning gaze fixing on Elliot. "And yet, here you are, demanding what you cannot comprehend. Do you truly think you can unmake what has been bound?" Elliot didn't flinch. "I'm willing to try." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, the field was utterly still. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, the whisperer raised a hand, and the ground beneath us trembled. Shadows erupted from the earth, twisting and writhing as they coiled toward us like living things. "Move!" Elliot shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me back. We stumbled as the shadows lashed out, striking the ground where we had been standing moments before. My flashlight flickered wildly, its beam barely cutting through the swirling darkness. I could see the shadows surging around us, their forms constantly shifting, each movement accompanied by that terrible, whispering chorus. "What do we do?" I yelled, my voice barely audible over the cacophony. "Break the tether," Elliot shouted back. "It's the only way." I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I trusted him. I always had. Together, we fought our way toward the center of the field, where the glow was brightest. The shadows clawed at us, their touch icy and sharp, but we pushed forward, driven by sheer determination. As we reached the heart of the field, I saw it, a glowing symbol carved into the ground, pulsing like a heartbeat. It was the same symbol we had seen on the ring, on the photographs, on the performers. The source of the tether. Elliot knelt beside it, his hands trembling as he reached for the edges of the symbol. "Help me," he said, his voice tight with urgency. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands working alongside his to scrape away the earth, to disrupt the glowing lines. The light grew brighter with each movement, the roar of the whisperer's voice growing louder, more desperate. "No," it thundered, its voice filled with fury. "You cannot." But it was too late. With one final motion, we broke the last line of the symbol, and the light exploded outward in a blinding wave. The roar of the whisperer was drowned out by the sound of shattering glass, and the shadows around us disintegrated, dissolving into the air like smoke. When the light faded, the field was silent once more. The performers were gone, their twisted forms replaced by an eerie stillness. The air was clear, the oppressive weight lifted. "It's over," Elliot said, his voice quiet, almost disbelieving. I nodded, though my hands were still trembling. "Do you free them?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. He looked out over the field, his expression distant. "I think we did." The whisperer was gone. The circus was gone. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the night was quiet.